Hi, this week I want to talk about how important it is, if you're in any kind of Christian leadership, of reading and reading as widely as possible. In today's world, where literacy in general is not so much the problem in at least places like the United States of America, reading is a very important part of the Christian life generally, and especially the case if you are involved in any kind of Christian leadership. Now, the most basic thing that every Christian should be reading, and certainly Christian leaders should be reading, is the Bible. If you're not reading the Bible on a regular basis, if you're not going to it over and over and over again, it really needs to be something that you need to be doing. Because if you're in any kind of Christian leadership, the Bible needs to be not only the first place that we turn for any kind of information and to hear the voice of God, but the thing to which we turn over and over and over again throughout the course of ministry and reflection. Another thing that Christians could very well be reading are things like other spiritual books, other books on theology or biblical studies in some capacity, or involvement in leading churches and all the rest. Those things can oftentimes be very helpful because they're kind of a way we can listen to the saints throughout the ages of the church, and so sometimes they can make us have connections that we wouldn't have made on our own, to kind of see how things fit together in new ways. We might come to conclusions by their guidance that we wouldn't have come to on our own, and so it's very helpful for them to kind of jumpstart and to speed along our own understanding. Sometimes one of the very most helpful things that can happen is if you get presented with a way of reading a passage in the Bible that is a way that's unlike anything you have thought on your own. That can be especially common when you are reading people with whom you significantly disagree. But I plan on making a video about reading people you don't agree with later on, so I'll say more about it at that point. What I'm hoping to do is to encourage people and to encourage you to read widely, by which I mean beyond just what the Bible says and what spiritual books would say. One of the most obvious kinds of resources to turn to are things like philosophy. Philosophy and theology have oftentimes, since the very earliest days, been very closely related, sometimes even intertwined. Christians have always been involved in the philosophical enterprise. There's a certain amount of controversy about this part, and so I realize that I'm only kind of presenting my own perspective on things. But I would encourage you to read philosophy and to get in your mind around philosophical topics, but I would also caution you at the very same time to not too quickly equate what you might be reading in philosophy with the truth. Because you see, the thing is that the whole point of philosophy is to write convincing arguments. I mean, yes, there's a search for truth in some capacity, but in a big way, the whole point is you need to be able to write what you believe to be the case in a way that's going to convince people. And so what that means is that at least sometimes you can be convinced of something by the philosophical writing that may not necessarily be true. And this is obvious if you look at any kind of a historical survey of ancient and earlier types of philosophy, because it's amazing how quickly, in some cases, the very same position that seems so obvious to one group of people at one point in time can turn out later on, like today, to seem completely ridiculous, and we wonder how we could have ever believed it. One of the things I have found so helpful in reading philosophy, though, is that it can help to illuminate how it is people in general, and some specific people in particular, how they have thought over the years. It helps to understand what the whole range of views have been on any particular topic. It can also be really helpful if you try to trace down where ideas came from in the first place. I have always been amazed at how many times things that I used to hear all the time in the church, and things that many faithful Christians say, have their source not in the Bible, but in pagan, Stoic, and Neoplatonic philosophy. I realized that Christian theology and Neoplatonic philosophy got really intertwined for a while, but it's interesting to notice that it wasn't like the church was making the same arguments in the first century. It's only when the Neoplatonic perspective really got going that Christians started making some of the same arguments. I would encourage you also to take seriously the idea of reading literature. Now, part of that's because you can find philosophy and theology in various kinds of literature. Some philosophers have written specifically using literary forms as a way to communicate. But even those who haven't been, sometimes you can pick up within the characters certain bits and pieces. Now, some people might not call those things philosophy and theology, but they certainly form a kind of folk philosophy or a folk theology. It might sometimes give a clue as to where other people, either inside or outside the church, are coming from in a way that you wouldn't necessarily pick up if all you read were Christian leaders and the Bible. Now, of course, it's clear that not every piece of literature is going to be equally helpful in that regard. And so you may find that some things are more helpful than others. But it's amazing what you might find when you keep your eyes open to it. People who know me realize that I am really big into movies, especially in the last several years. And what I have found is that just like literature can sometimes pose questions or provoke thoughts in new ways by presenting things in a new way, movies can oftentimes do that as well. Now, it is true that Hollywood films are not always going to be great at that because there's such a desire to have a mass appeal and not to be too challenging, because if you make people become uncomfortable when they see a movie, they might not want to come back and see it again, and they sure may not buy the DVD when they're done. But if you broaden out your experience to also include some of the giants of international cinema, you may find that there's a lot to offer there, and you'd be rewarded for checking it out. Some of my personal favorites as far as posing questions and making me think about things in new ways are people like Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, Polish director Krzysztof Kieślowski, and Danish director early in cinema Carl Dreyer. Some of their work has really been some of the most stimulating that I've ever encountered. Essentially what I'm getting at is I want you to avoid a particular pitfall that I think is so tempting for people who are even in small levels of Christian leadership, and that is to be reading things and to be engaging with things and thinking about things only in kind of a utilitarian or instrumentalist manner. That is, what I want you to be able to avoid is the tendency to read what you read or think about what you think about only because you know how you intend to use it, either for some kind of sermon that you're preaching or some kind of study that you're leading or some other kind of communication or a debate you're getting ready to have. When you're only reading for a specific purpose in mind, that will, it will blind you potentially, and or at least partially, to the other things you might learn from some of the same sources. You might be reading something for one purpose, and so there may be something else very important for you to read in that same source, but since you're only looking for what they say about that one thing, you might miss the larger picture. But it may also be the case that you don't read the kinds of sources, you don't allow yourself to read the kinds of sources that you don't see having an immediate impact on what you're trying to do. And when you do that, you cut yourself off from some very important sources of reflection and stimulation and encouragement. Speaking for myself, the most stimulating and helpful and challenging and encouraging things I've ever read have come from things that I wasn't reading with a particular purpose in mind. Maybe I was reading a particular author or even a theologian just because I heard they were significant, or I wanted to know more about what they said in general, and I found myself going down a rabbit hole with them. Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to do with a particular piece of literature or a particular movie that I've seen. I've been working my way through Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, and very little of what I'm reading there gets brought up explicitly, clearly in any kind of sermon or teaching that I'm doing. But I know that it is permeates who I am and begins to affect me in little ways and shapes the way that I not only read the Bible, but how I engage with the world. And if I cut myself off from it because a 6 million word book is not exactly something that you can simply take and digest for a single sermon, if I cut myself off from that because I couldn't see immediately how it would be applicable for a sermon, I would miss a lot of very important stuff that I should know, that I would like to know, that will help me to know and has helped me grow, but I wouldn't have known about. The fact of the matter is, we live in a time in history where we have more information available at our fingertips than at any point in history. So my encouragement is, don't restrict your diet to only things that you know are going to help you. Be willing to try some new things. Be able to expand your horizon and to experience different things. You keep yourself grounded in the faith, keep yourself grounded in the scriptures. But if you go and you look and you say, I'm going to read a whole bunch of things, but I may not agree with everything that I read. I may not, know how to make sense out of everything that I read, but I'm going to read widely. I'm going to have all these range of ideas thrown at me, because it may be that by doing that will help you to clarify what you think. Again, I'm going to revisit the topic of reading people with whom you disagree, sometimes very profoundly, in a later video. But I want to encourage you to read widely, to gain what you can from any manner of sources, and you may be very surprised to discover what you gain by doing it. Well, that's all for this week. If you find these videos either helpful or at least interesting, you can consider liking them on Facebook or sharing them on Facebook. Also, you can like the Bible and Theology Time page. Or if you want, you can go to the YouTube page where these things are hosted, and my channel is tstevic1. If you have any questions, if you have any topics you'd like me to take up, if you have anything that's kind of gnawing at you, please send me an email at pastorstevic@gmail.com. I'll try to take it up, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.